It's 7 o'clock. I'm Jonathan Samuels and welcome to a Sky News special programme. Last night we reported a senior US military figure's warning that the British Army is no longer regarded as a top-level fighting force. Well, today the Prime Minister defended his record on defence spending, even as the Armed Forces Minister admitted there had been underinvestment for decades. Well, tonight, with the help of an expert panel of guests, we're asking a fundamental question about our role in the world at a time of war in Europe and with the prospect of new conflicts coming over the horizon. Is the army fighting fit?
Britain has long prided itself in fielding a force that others seek to follow. Now, sources have revealed a senior US general told the Defence Secretary that the British Army is no longer regarded as a top-level or Tier 1 fighting force.
I don't accept that criticism at all. I mean, we have the largest defence spending of any country in Europe.
Putin, when he looked at going into Ukraine and looked at political will, must have thought, I'll factor that into my gamble. They're not ready to contribute anything other than good words for a number of years to come.
We have all made strategic errors in our defence policies over the last 2 decades because we've had treasuries that have done short-term. We have hollowed out as company. Governments after government have wanted more but not wanted to fund it. His government was no different. I was serving in the army under his government. I know exactly what it was like.
Standing up to aggression everywhere is good for all of our security. And when I was Chancellor, we increased funding in the armed forces by a record amount as well, because we recognised that the world had changed and was becoming a less safe place.
The Army's programmes are many billions behind schedule and many years behind schedule.
I don't know whether he sees himself as a wartime Prime Minister, but he is. The Prime Minister is the Prime Minister at the present moment, and he's got to rise to the occasion.
We are now at war in Europe. We need to move to a war footing. We need to face Russia directly and rather than leaving Ukraine to do all the work.
So let's bring in our guests. Joining me from Kyiv is our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who broke this story last night. General Sir Richard Shirreff, a former NATO Deputy Supreme Commander for Europe. Louise Jones, Head of Intelligence at Mackenzie Intelligence Services, who formerly served as an officer in the British Army Intelligence Corps, and Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. A very good evening to all of you. Thank you for your time. Lots to discuss, and we'll get into the specifics soon. But first of all, I wanted to get your individual reaction to this damning verdict from a US general. And Deborah, perhaps we can come to you first. What sort of reaction have you had, both at home and abroad, to your report?
It's really underlining or confirming what many people who follow defence suspected or knew already. The army has been underfunded for decades as both Conservative, Labour and coalition governments took what was described as a peace dividend following the end of the Cold War, shifting resource into other areas, and the army, the navy and the air force all withering. But the problem is, there has been new investment over the last few years, but the army seems to be the one faring the least. And right now, with a war here in Ukraine, it's the army that's giving equipment to the Ukrainians, and it really does expose just how bare the stockpiles are back at home.
And Elizabeth Braw, are the thoughts of this US general more widely felt, do you think, amongst the US military?
Well, the US military has one job, which is to fight wars. And so, of course, if another country's armed forces are not as good as the US armed forces, they will highlight that. But we should remember that decision makers in the UK have so many other considerations to take into account. So I think it's a little bit unfair on the British Army, or indeed the British military as such, to dismiss it as no longer first here. And we should also remember that this is not just the UK that's in that position. Almost every European country, bar Finland and Estonia, have been or were reducing their defense budgets for many years until then. In 2014, they started spending more again. So let's not be overly unfair on the UK, but it is certainly true that the British Army has lost, as Deborah said, has lost vis-a-vis its sister services, has lost more investments than maybe should have been the case.
OK, and General Sir Richard Shirreff, you have a huge amount of experience of the British military. Do you believe that the British Army is no longer a top-level fighting force?
Well, let's just be clear. Firstly, the people who serve, the men and women who serve in the British Army, are absolutely second to none, and the quality and the commitment is absolutely what this nation needs. But the US general who said these words is absolutely right, and I think that the truth is that to be fighting fit, an army needs more than really good people. It's got to have equipment. Enough of it, and it's got to be modern and suited to the needs of 21st century warfare. It's got to have logistics, ammunition, and the capability to really dig deep to fight the sort of wars that we're seeing now in Ukraine, a state-on-state industrial war. And it's got to have the sustainability, the logistics, the sustainability, and it's got to be able to train. And in all those areas, less in terms of quality of people, it is failing.
OK, and Louise Jones is here with me in the studio. Louise, do you think we're still a Tier 1 military force, or have we been relegated to Tier 2, perhaps?
Well, unfortunately, you know, and taking into account the calibre of those who serve, unfortunately, when you look at our kit and equipment, I think we're flattering ourselves to call ourselves even Tier 2 when you look at the investment that many of our comparator countries that have made recently. I mean, you look over the last decade, we've spent a similar amount to France on new vehicles. They've brought hundreds into service, and we've barely got a new quad bike in.
OK, well, we'll dig into all of this in a bit more detail shortly, but we have been speaking to the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, this evening about Deborah's story. Why don't we take a listen to what he had to say?
We were told by defence sources that a senior US general said to you that the British Army is no longer regarded as a Tier 1 force. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, first of all, I've been very clear for a number of years now as Defence Secretary that the British Army has fallen behind its peer group and needed investment, and that's why Boris Johnson in 2020 gave us a record settlement supported by Rishi when he was Chancellor of £16 billion extra in order to invest in our army. And we're starting to do that right now. And as I give you this interview, there are people making armoured vehicles in Telford and tanks and all sorts of things which are the result of that investment.
Now, clearly there are people inside the building and across defence that are very worried about the current hollowing out of the army. Yes, you have a plan for modernisation, but they say it will not deliver fast enough because the threat is now and you need more money faster. What are you going to do about it?
Well, firstly, it's not the currently hollowing out. Defence has been hollowed out under Labour and Conservative for something like 20, 30 years. I was serving in the armed forces when that hollowing was going out. It was that long ago. This is the point that, you know, the music starts to stop, the direction of travel changes. We've had a very predominantly peaceful and stable world for the last 20 years. That is not the case anymore. Russia is, you know, inflicting a war on Europe, in Europe, against Ukraine. The rise of China, the tensions in the Pacific, radicalization across Africa, the world is becoming more unstable and more insecure, and I think that's why, you know, the Prime Minister at the time in 2020 and Rishi recognised there's a requirement to meet that new threat. But it's not a new thing, hollowing out. What we're seeing now is the consequences of hollowing out. And, you know, as a Defence Secretary, I've always said I'm not going to pretend things are perfect. I'm not going to sort of say, look over here, look at the red arrows and shoot them the colour. I'm going to actually say, that's what's going on behind the scenes, and we're going to try and fix it. And I would rather have a perfectly formed, properly protected men and women of the armed forces of a size we can afford and an ambition we can afford than pretend we're somehow, you know, reaching beyond ourselves.
OK, now, your Armed Forces Minister just said that the Army needs urgent recapitalisation, that the PM gets it and a budget is coming. What does he mean by that?
Well, it does need urgent recapitalisation, and that's why we're investing it. We're investing £34 billion in the Army's equipment plan between now and 2033. That's new helicopters, that is new tanks, new armed personnel carriers, new electronic warfare, in a whole range of suite to modernise their fleet, something that didn't happen in my day, and I think it's really, really important that the public understand we are doing it. Now, the criticism about it needs to happen now is these things don't happen now. There's no magic wand, there's no factories whirring away like car factories that you just press buttons and out they come. There are only about 2 countries on the earth that can sustain almost constant production lines. That's China and the United States. And, you know, of course we can seek to buy from abroad, but then there won't be a UK defence and aerospace industry, and we won't be able to necessarily give our troops the exact equipment they want. So we have to always make that balance. But, you know, Ukraine is exposed, its supply chains have been frozen or you know, out of commission for far too long. We face that challenge. Spain, Germany, France, Italy, all the European countries face that challenge. And that's what that new money is going towards. And that's why it's important to send a demand signal to industry to say we are investing. That's what we did with the Defence Command Paper in 2020. We'll continue to do so.
Now, finally, what is the danger for UK security if the PM does not give you the increase in funding of £3 billion a year that defence sources say is needed for the Army?
Well, I'm not going to go into these defence sources. I think, first and foremost, we have a comprehensive spending plan that takes us roughly to the end of 2024. We're on track to continue that investment. I think the reality is, as I've always said, is we need to modernise our armed forces and keep pace. But there's also another thing that we can do in government, which is make sure that we match our appetite with the size of our stomach. You know, we can do lots of things as the British Armed Forces. Our armed forces are some of the best in the world. But of course, what we mustn't do is overreach or overpromise and try and do everything for everybody, because that's in the end how you get in financial problems. So I think it's a two-way discussion. How much do you want to do? That's how much it's going to cost, and then we come to an arrangement. But let's see what happens in the next few weeks and months.
So that was the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace responding to Deborah's report. Why don't we ask the question then, what is the scale of the problem as was suggested by that US General? Let's go to General Sir Richard Shirreff first. You've already explained what your worries are, but what is of most concern to you, Sir Richard? Is it lack of ammunition? Is it procurement issues? Is it the fact that we now have a much smaller army?
It's good to hear that the Defence Secretary is getting behind the wheel and determined to make things better. But let's be clear as well, it's about the way the money is being spent. Yes, of course, we all understand that times are hard and money's in short supply. But I think defence needs to look really carefully at itself and really focus on what are the priorities. Where is the debate about the nuclear deterrent, for example, which gobbles up a huge sums of money from defence? Where is the debate about the balance between the wolf nearest the sledge, which is war in Europe, and deterring war in Europe and providing support to the Ukrainians and being prepared for the worst case, which is to fight a land war in Europe on our doorstep, and the, shall I say, naval posturing we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific region, which is probably a less urgent priority, nice to have. Where is the focus on the absolute requirement for the kit that's required? It seems to me that we have an army that is designing and bringing into service equipment designed for the last war in Afghanistan, wheeled armored personnel carriers, a medium tank that has turned into a procurement disaster in the Ajax. This is not a capability that is required to slug it out with Russian tanks in Eastern Europe, of course supported by air, aviation, drones, and all the rest of the plethora of military kit. So I think the Defence Ministry needs to look very carefully at its own priorities. Yes, of course, more is needed in defence spending terms, but that money needs to be spent much better.
OK, let's ask Louise Jones a similar question. It does seem, doesn't it, that the Navy and the RAF have had a great deal of investment in recent years, but the Army really hasn't, cut down to 10,000 troops. Why do you think the Army has borne the brunt of cuts?
Well, frankly, it's just a result of procurement processes and decisions made not with the strategic long-term thinking that we need, but rather focusing on actually where can we make the savings as soon as possible. The Army's equipment programmes and most of its costs you can make a cut to year in year. So there's been this really short-term thinking that's meant that we've prioritised spending on the big ticket items for the Navy and the RAF. And also, frankly, you know, those higher up in the Navy and RAF have done a much better job of advocating for, yes, we need 2 aircraft carriers. Those higher up in the Army have not been effective in making a similar case at all.
OK, let's turn to Deborah, who's in Ukraine, because many people watching this, Deborah, will know that we're sending tanks, 14 of them, to help with the conflict out there. But there's the question, if we're already stretched, what sort of hole will that leave in our military back home?
Well, a big one. I mean, the fact is that you had the head of the army a couple of weeks ago in an internal message saying that this giving of tanks and also these AS-90 guns, big artillery pieces that the army is giving to the Ukrainians, that's going to make the army temporarily weaker. So the fact that such a relatively small sounding number of pieces of equipment is having such a massive effect on the army back home should really be an indicator of the problems that you're seeing. And I think the fact that you're having government ministers, serving government ministers, openly talking about underinvestment, serial underinvestment, those are the words that James Heapy used, over decades, saying there's an urgent need for recapitalisation, again, underlining that sense of urgency, really should be alarming for people, because it does speak to a force that's nearly broken. Some people I speak to say that they believe the army already is broken, and just underlining what General Sheriff said, it's nothing to do with the personnel serving. There are great men and women serving in our armed forces. It is about the equipment that they're using. It's about the hollowed out stockpiles. It's about the fact there isn't money for them to be training. It's the fact that they don't have the warfighting capability that they're supposed to have if they are to be this tier 1 fighting force that the Prime Minister actually apparently still believes that we have, and it's clearly something that we're attaining to return to.
Yeah, so Richard nodding his head as you're speaking, but it'd be good to get the thoughts from across the pond, because Deborah, Elizabeth, I wonder if there's a sense in the States that the UK has taken its eye off the ball a little bit over recent years. We've concentrated a lot here on AI, on drones, on cyber warfare, more so than boots and bullets. And of course, now we're seeing exactly that with the conflict in Ukraine.
Well, the reality is that the US armed forces, with their enormous budget of around $700 billion and even more, can do a lot more than the UK. And I think that the problem that the UK faces is that it never redefined what its armed forces should be about after the end of World War II, and then again after the Cold War. So we're used to the UK armed forces having globe-spanning capabilities, and then when the UK declined as a political entity in the world, there wasn't really a conversation between the government and the public about what the role of the UK armed forces should be. Should they still have this global ambition, or should they be reduced to the size of a country of the size of the UK as it is now today and has been for the past 30 years. So the UK armed forces, as a result, have been punching above their weight for a very long time, underfunded and with the men and women in uniform doing great work, but not with resources matching the ambition that was set out for them. And that, I think, leads to the question of should the government have a conversation with the public about what we want, what the UK wants its armed forces to be able to do. Would the public support a much bigger budget, and if so, at the expense of what? But that needs to be That's an honest debate that needs to be had, rather than a debate to be had among defense experts, who, of course, will all say that the armed forces need to be bigger and have a bigger budget. If the public can voice its opinion, and then if it does voice its opinion and voice support for larger armed forces, it would also be easier to get that additional money to the armed forces.
Yeah, you make a very good point. We're going to discuss that a little bit later in the programme. What is the UK's UK's place in the world right now. But you mentioned budgets as well, and I want to concentrate a little bit on that and look in more detail at what the data tells us about how much the UK actually spends on defence and how it compares with the rest of the world. Here's our data and forensics correspondent, Tom Cheshire.
This is really a story of choices. Behind me is the UK's defence spending as a percentage of GDP since the end of the Cold War. Less money being spent as the perceived threat recedes. And much of that money being spent elsewhere. This is what health spending has done over a similar period, not too far off, but really moving away over recent years. And that's a choice made by successive governments. But that reduction in spending has meant a reduction in armed forces personnel. And you can see just how much that has fallen. But the UK isn't alone here. Many other countries reacted the same way to the end of the Cold War. This shows the proportion of GDP spent by different countries over the same time. It's a similar picture. This is where the UK is in gold. We're in the middle of the pack, really. You're behind US and Russia. But we spend more than they do in absolute terms. Then you've got other countries like Poland, which today has announced it's increasing its defence budget to 4% of GDP. The question is, what do we spend that money on? And this is the equipment plan for the Ministry of Defence, what they're going to spend money on the next 10 years. Nuclear deterrent is the biggest one. Then you've got the Royal Air Force. The army is getting less of that money, which is why we've heard some of these calls. And this comes back to the integrated review, this idea of a global Britain and a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And for that sort of strategy, you need new equipment, best exemplified by the Queen Elizabeth-class carriers. 2 of them delivered at a huge cost, £6.4 billion, to project power across the seas. Now, some experts have said that's putting money in the wrong place. They're expensive sitting ducks for anti-ship missiles. But land-based systems often have a similar problem. Compare those air carriers to the Ajax armoured vehicle. The MOD signed a contract for £5.5 billion for 589 vehicles. Supposed to come into service in 2017, but they have been plagued by technical problems around noise and vibration, and we are still waiting on that. And Ajax is just one, albeit a giant programme. The Public Accounts Committee has said the Ministry of Defence's entire procurement programme is broken. So there is a lot of money, more than nearly every other country on the planet, and a lot of it is not being spent well.
Interesting stuff, Tom Cheshire there. Well, let's look at the points raised in that report in a bit more detail. Louise, the UK's NATO commitment then is pretty good, isn't it? You know, we're right up there. Why then do we have so much concern that the army, the military is weakened?
So really the issue is not necessarily how much funding that the MOD gets. You know, personally, I wouldn't give them an extra penny. It's how they spend it. We've seen so much wastage. We've seen references there to Ajax. And really there needs to be top to bottom reform of the MOD to make sure that every penny of taxpayers' money is spent sensibly. For too long, we've had procurement done by enthusiastic amateurs. We need to make sure that we get procurement experts in who can go to these military equipment manufacturers and get a good deal that will deliver a piece of equipment that will be usable by our armed forces. You know, until we've sorted out all of those internal processes of the MOD, you could give them billions more and we still wouldn't see an improvement in capability. It's as simple as that.
Oh, really interesting. Well, let's put that exact point to Sir Richard then. It's not about how much money there is, it's about how well it's spent. Would you agree with that?
I said earlier, if you remember, it is about spending the money more efficiently. It's about prioritising. It's about putting together an inclusive review of defence that looks at the threats, looks at Britain's place in the world, takes some hard decisions about priorities. As I said earlier, do we really, you know, we should be looking and debating the question of the nuclear deterrence. You saw the huge proportion of defence spending that goes on that. We should be debating the whole business of the Indo-Pacific tilt. What worries me is that I hear vibes that say defence says that many in defence are saying Russia is a busted flush. We don't need to spend money on Central Europe and Eastern Europe and a land capability, and therefore the global Britain Indo-Pacific carrier strike tilt should continue. I think that is deeply flawed thinking, particularly with aircraft carriers that, frankly, are white elephants in the sort of war that we are likely to have to face in Europe. So I think we have to think very carefully about priorities, and we have to look very carefully at how defence is spent, how that defence money is spent.
Yeah, let's ask Deborah about that, because we've heard, haven't we, millions on Warrior armoured vehicles, billions overspent on those aircraft carriers, delays to nuclear submarines as well. I mean, if more money was available, will the military actually use it and spend it wisely?
It's really, really good criticism, and I think there's a huge concern looking at the track record on their ability to spend money. One of the things they've been trying to do for the last 10 years or so is to upgrade their communications gear so that they can embrace the fact that all of us are able to send images really quickly, voice messages really quickly, and use that in their armoured vehicles and on their own personal radios. And just doing that has dragged on and cost billions and produced nothing so far. So it's a really fair criticism that has to get fixed. But the problem is now in terms of the state of the army, and that's why people are saying they need extra money just to be able to try to get these transformation programmes on track. What General Sharif was saying about the nuclear programme, that's a massive concern. It takes up about 20% of the entire budget. And so when that maybe overspends, it squeezes out all the conventional equipment, which is, again, a huge problem. And what Elizabeth said earlier about prioritisation, about what the government wants its military for, and the Defence Secretary said that too. I remember back in 2010 when David Cameron was Prime Minister and they had this big defence review. They slashed the armed forces by about 30,000 personnel, and yet their ambition for what they wanted the country's military to achieve barely changed at all. The thing that you have is that the UK, it's a nuclear power, it's a permanent member of the Security Council, it's a G7 nation, it wants to have heft and power in the world. And if it wants that, though, it really has to pay for it. And that's where the problem lies.
Yeah, and just to conclude this section, Elizabeth, we've talked about the money, but how do we compare when it comes to readiness to fight? That, how do we compare with other countries in terms of that?
Well, I remember vividly an army conference a few years ago. I won't mention which conference it was, but it was a conference where army chiefs were on a panel together. And one of the army chiefs from a fellow European country stood up and said, well, I hear there is no time for jokes, so I won't tell you about the Bundeswehr. And that tells you something about the Bundeswehr, which is famously struggles with its readiness. The UK is much better set up, or has much better readiness record than the Bundeswehr. But I think also when it comes, if I may come back to a point that Louise made earlier about bringing in procurement experts, there is so much expertise in the private sector, executives, CEOs, chairmen and chairwomen who have retired from very senior positions in the private sector, who could lend a wise voice to the MOD beyond the boards that private sector executives are already members on. And there was an interesting experiment that the Swedish Armed Forces introduced a few years ago, where it hired a captain of industry, recently retired, to provide that sort of advice to the chief of defense, and he got to wear a uniform. I think it was a Navy captain uniform, and it was a temporary assignment so that he wouldn't overstay his welcome. But I think that sort of expertise would be really useful to bring in, whether in procurement or other areas where the armed forces, because they have their own expertise, don't typically excel, and which has resulted in these maybe not entirely successful investments.
Yeah, really interesting thought, that bringing in experts in various different fields to help. Hold that thought for a moment, because we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that defence spending doesn't exist in a vacuum, of course. It has to respond to the challenges of the times and to the needs of politicians and the public to ensure that Britain retains prestige and power on the world stage. Well, the last significant mission undertaken unilaterally by British forces was to regain the Falkland Islands back in 1982, a victory which many doubt would be achievable with today's military. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 prompted the end of the Cold War and a marked drop in defence spending across the West as the Russian threat receded. The decade of relative stability that ensued was shattered, wasn't it, by the 9/11 attacks in 2001, which triggered a new age of insecurity and US and British engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq, but without a significant increase in military spending here in the UK. But despite the Middle East entanglements, it's been China which has in recent years been seen as the dominant threat to Western security, both in cyberspace but also on the ground against Taiwan. Now, however, it is a long-brewing resurgence of Russian military action, which has increased fears of unpreparedness, with the Ukraine invasion once again bringing war to Europe. Well, let's talk about the big picture then and Britain's role in the world. We'll go back to Deborah, I think, in Kiev. Do we actually need to be in Tier 1, Deborah? I mean, you've touched on this already, but do we actually need to rethink our global position militarily and not get so hung up about being the very best?
Well, I think that it's a political decision, and it's a decision, as well, as Elizabeth said, that maybe the public should be asked to have a vote on. But I think the reality is that the world as it is today, with these increasing threats from authoritarian regimes, challenging our way of, the way of life in democratic societies, challenging that rules-based order that has really grown up since the end of the Second World War, designed to help democracies and to try to restrict authoritarian rule. If we want to play a part in protecting all of that, then maintaining a Tier 1 top-level fighting force makes sense. But as I said before, it requires choice of investment. It's not about asking the taxpayer to pay more necessarily. It's about maybe diverting funds more towards defence. And absolutely crucially, it's about ensuring that that money is spent better. It really frustrates me when you hear the government bat off criticism about defence spending and the state of defence by saying they have the biggest budget of any European any NATO country in Europe. It's nonsensical unless you look at what that money is actually buying. And right now, as we see with the army, it's very little.
OK, General Sharif, you're nodding away there, and I'm playing the devil's advocate a little bit here. But we'll always be part of a coalition, won't we? Why don't we concentrate on the bits that we're really good at and accept that perhaps we're not going to be this global force that's brilliant at everything, because we know we have allies to look after us in those areas that we're not so strong at?
I think you need to consider two other aspects which haven't been discussed. Number one is the attitude of our American allies, our number one ally. And number two is the attitudes of our European friends. There would be widespread dismay, and I spent many years in the NATO world, widespread dismay, and there has been, and I've listened to it, as people look at the way the military in this country have been consistently dismantled over the last decade, and they say to us, what on earth is going on? You are the one country we admire and respect because we know that we can rely on you for the quality of your armed forces. The second point I'd make is, or I'd add to that, if we're going to carry weight with the Americans, our number one ally, we've got to be able to deliver a credible, capable, properly designed warfighting force. It does not have to match the Americans in size, of course not. But one war you did not touch on was the Gulf War in 1991, where we sent a properly joined up armored division with significant logistics, all the artillery that it needed, and the air as well. That carried weight with the Americans. And if we are to carry weight with our American allies, the absolute minimum we should be capable of delivering on the battlefield is a division, a properly joined up warfighting division of 25,000, together with the artillery, logistics, etc., etc. We are now so far behind there. We're going to need a significant injection of funding, prioritized, perhaps within defence, but also from outside, in order to deliver that capability. And one final point is, we started with talking about the quality of our men and women in the armed forces. We have to look after them better. If you go and look at a lot of the army quarters and other quarters, no doubt serving the Navy and Air Force around the bazaars, and if you look at some of the Twitter feeds, young families left without central heating, boilers breaking down, because the system for looking after our people, the money that goes into married quarters, is frankly derisory. And it's not surprising that people are probably likely to walk because they're not being properly looked after in that respect.
OK, lots to think about there with Louise Jones in the studio. What do you take away from what General Sharif was saying there?
Well, just to approach his last point, he's absolutely right. You know, a department that can't even run a contract to fix boilers in people's houses, I don't see how we could trust them to deliver complicated equipment programmes at the same time. And then also, just for some of the points that he raised earlier, there are some very difficult prioritisation calls that need to be made. We really need those in government to be very brave about which sacred cows we're discussing. I'm not necessarily sure I would agree with Sir Richard about necessarily the nuclear deterrent, but there's plenty of sacred cows we should be addressing. For too long, the army has tried to hold on to certain cap badges, certain legacy capabilities, you know, like having a parachute brigade. There's really difficult decisions that have got to be made, and only then can we raise the investment needed to, as the General alludes to, really have a reset and deliver a war-fighting division. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that we should stick to the old ambition of being just as good as the Americans, but, you know, in one small package. We really need to look at how we work with our allies to make sure that we complement. Of course, we need decent artillery. Very important we have a logistics chain, which is completely missing at the moment. But fundamentally, we need to make sure that we are more closely complementary with our allies than we have been before.
OK, thank you for that. And let's get a final thought, shall we, from Elizabeth Braw in Washington. I mean, do you think the UK is kidding itself, Elizabeth, about the need for a mighty army? Do you think it's become almost a status symbol for us, and that perhaps we need to rethink the size of it?
Well, it certainly has become a status symbol, and it's one of the things that makes the UK what it is. No other country has an army at this level at its disposal for tasks ranging from the Queen's funeral to providing oxygen and all manner of PPE during the COVID crisis, to fighting complicated conflicts in faraway countries. It's really extremely impressive. But the fundamental problem, I think, is that all these men and women are hidden from public view, except when there is a crisis, when they turn up and deliver whatever it is that needs to be delivered, or carry out ceremonial duties, or indeed fight wars. And if we don't have that connection between the army and the general public won't realize that this is a crucial institution that needs to be funded, and that it consists of men and women like them. And if we had more interaction between the army and indeed the Air Force and the Royal Navy, I think the public would be much more interested and much more willing to support larger budgets, and they would also indeed be much more willing to join the army themselves. But with these large bases that we have hidden from public view, how are people supposed to feel a connection to the army? And so I wish that there would be more interaction, maybe through open houses in army bases. I realize there are security issues there, but without that connection, it's not an army and it's not the military representing the wider public, and as a result, the wider public will feel less connection to it.
Yeah, something the Americans do very well, of course. Well, it's been a fascinating debate. You've all given us lots to chew over. Thank you very much indeed. That's all for this special programme. My thanks to all of my guests, Deborah Haynes in Kiev, General Sir Richard Sharif, former NATO commander, also Louise Jones here in the studio, Head of Intelligence at Mackenzie Intelligence Services, and Elizabeth Braw speaking to us from Washington, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Good to see you. Thank you.